G'day and welcome to another Scott Poynton podcast. And today I'm excited to speak with a person that I've known, I don't know how long, I'm going to say 20 years. It might even be longer. Katie Critchlow. Katie Critchlow is a sustainability leader and has done amazing things in her life and in her career. And she's very active on LinkedIn. You should all follow Katie on LinkedIn. We'll talk about that later. But she's very active and has strong views based on years of experience. And I would say a wonderful set of values where she really believes in what she's doing and gets upset when she sees other people not necessarily doing the right thing based on what's good for the planet, what's good for people, what's good for other species. And I always love reading Katie's missives on LinkedIn because I always feel I learn something, and she highlights some really interesting points. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Katie Critchlow. How are you, Katie?
Really good, thanks, Scott. Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, doing good. A bit warm. We've got a heat wave here, and I'm sure we're going to touch on climate change at some stage in our discussion. But a bit of a heat wave here in Switzerland. Not unusual for the last 10 years, but certainly becoming more common and not so good for the forests and things that surround me. What about where you are? What's the situation there?
Yeah, very, very warm. We've had a very, very dry summer. So the farmers that we're working with at the moment, because we're doing ag stuff, they've had a pretty poor harvest. The water companies are putting out warnings that we haven't got enough water. So yeah, pretty standard times at the moment, I guess. Pretty
standard times. And you mentioned about what you're doing, and we're going to come to that. But I'd like to just go back, Katie, and spend a bit of time. Not too long, because you're doing so many interesting things and we want to come to that. But you had such a long and diverse career. You're only young, let's make that clear. Katie's been at it for a long time, but she's only young, and so she's still got much to contribute. But just tell us a bit about where you grew up, Katie, and how you came to be so passionate about sustainability.
Yeah, so I live in the UK and grew up in the UK, pretty standard childhood. Mum who was, member of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and things like that, but didn't really talk too much about the environment. But my whole family is neurodiverse, and what I've come to realise is that there's a lot of what a lovely lady called Solitaire Townsend calls neurospicy solutionists, like people that have a neurodiversity seemed to tend to have a deep empathy with the planet and other species and our own species in a way that I think maybe other people don't. I don't know. So I think that's probably, I didn't know it until very recently, but I think that's been one of the things that's driven me. So I studied biology at Oxford when I was, after I left school. And that gave me this good understanding of nature and how sort of vital all the other things that live on Earth are for our own survival, and really how little we know about them. So, and I remember writing an essay for one of my exams about how we could value nature and think about it in a different way. And I got a really bad mark for that. I think it's the worst mark I got for my whole course, because the professor was like, "What are you on about?"
You're on drugs.
Whereas I think nowadays it's sort of, become quite the in thing to do. So that was like more than 25 years ago. But yeah, I left uni. I'd sort of picked biology really because I sort of was good at it and I didn't know what else I wanted to do. And I didn't really know that I was going to use it in the rest of my career, because I definitely didn't want to be a lab scientist. I'm quite a terrible practical person. So didn't see my career as a scientist, but actually it's so interesting to me how that understanding of the natural world and ecology and how important life is to humanity has really then shaped and weaved into my career in ways that I'd never really sort of thought about at the time. So where we met was when in my first job at Marks and Spencer. So I'd actually applied to do a PhD in sustainable sourcing after I left university. And my boss, Mike Barry, sort of interviewed me for that and said, I don't think you're a PhD person. I think you're just going to come and work for me and try and sort out forests and palm oil and fisheries and all sorts of things like that. And I thought, oh, okay. And so, yeah, that's where I came across you the first time at TFT, trying to sort out pulp mills in Indonesia and garden furniture supply chains and all sorts of things.
That's right.
And so, yeah, my job at Marks and Spencer, I was there for sort of 5 or 6 years.
Just tell us about, I mean, at the time it was really pioneering stuff, Katie. I remember Plan B, I think, was the sort of brand.
Plan A, because there is no Plan B.
That's right.
yeah, that's it.
Plan A, because there is no Plan B. Just talk us through that. What was the plan there? What was the strategy?
I joined M&S at a time where Mike had this idea that supermarkets looking at their lorries and their lighting and a bit about their waste wasn't really where it was at in terms of the footprint of retail and the sort of whole, food and home system. But that was not really talked about very much. And so a colleague of mine, Roland Hill, did this big sort of life cycle assessment and big footprint of Marks and Spencer and opened everyone's eyes to sort of say, by far and away, the biggest impact that a retailer has or in the food system isn't in what your fridges and your lights are doing in the store, but it's where you're growing it and where you're sourcing it from and how you're sourcing it. And that at the time was quite revolutionary. And so we sort of then set about a few years of sort of building the case within Marks and Spencer to not be looking just at stores and lorries, but to look at the supply chain. We were some of the founding members of things like RSPO and the Better Cotton Initiative and that sort of thing, because we realized that we wanted to know where our cotton and our wood and our fish came from, but it wasn't a question that anyone had asked at that time. And so the supply chains were very opaque. There was lots of barriers in the way. It's actually one of the things I feel really sad about now, when a lot of people still tell me that that's not possible, which is just not true. It's just the will's not there now, because enough people have asked the question enough times for that problem to have been solved if we wanted to.
Yes.
But yeah, so we set about doing a lot of sustainable sourcing, and then we moved into having really the backing of the CEO at the time, Stuart Rose, and he really deeply understood that Marks and Spencer's brand was based on trust, and that people really wanted us to have done all that thinking for them about where stuff came from, and that we're not using child labour and we're not cutting down tropical forests to make garden furniture. We then had this thing, Plan A, which was a big business change program. So then it was like, going to the board to ask for £200 million of business change money to, literally change everything about how we did business. And at the time, I remember making these commitments that were going to kind of come to fruition in 2015 and even 2020. And that seemed like so far away. And when I looked back, there's a saying that people have, which I think is so true, which is you massively overestimate what you can do in a year and massively underestimate what you can do in a decade. And it's that, I look back and think at some of the things we did where, real progress has been made in that decade. But then in other senses, we're sort of 25 years on, and I'm still talking to people now in my current business about how are we going to get rid of peat? We knew that peat was an issue 25 years ago in horticulture, and as I say, a lot of these problems they've not been solved because humans can't do that. And think of all the other stuff we've done in that time, like AI and all sorts of things.
Right.
The idea that we can't figure out how to grow a plant without peat is sort of
nonsensical.
Yes.
There's so many of those things. It drives me crazy. Like you, Katie, I've been in this space for a long time, and you just think, my goodness, we're still talking about that. And,
yes.
It just drives me bonkers. And you hear people being very earnest about how difficult it is and all the rest of it. Absolute bollocks. You can do these things. You've got to have the will to do it. It doesn't mean it's not complex. Let's not say it's simple.
No.
But if you have the will, you can do these things. And so you've seen a lot of that. And I guess, what would be, looking back on that period, I mean, we've got other periods where we're going to discuss in a second, but looking back on that period, what was your biggest happiness? What was your biggest achievement? And looking back and seeing where we are now, what would be your biggest disappointment about that energy that came when you launched Plan A, and still here we are? What are your feelings about those things?
Yeah, so, I think I left the sort of big corporate sustainability world because ultimately I was tired of doing bad stuff a little bit less bad. But, the change that M&S made at that time, as I say, to get people to raise their eye line. So this stupid thing that you always hear, the UK is only responsible for 1% of global emissions. What we mean is, if you draw a boundary around the UK island, we're only responsible for 1%. But when you look at how much carbon, fossil fuels we finance, when you look at our supply chains that we've just outsourced the problem to other parts of the world, I think that movement and that momentum that we helped to create, to go from, my sort of scope 1, as you would call it now, to the scope 3 was huge. But I think I felt really, really proud of that, and still feel proud of that. And still, if I go into M&S today or H&M or various places and I see just casual labels of recycled polyester, sustainable cotton, that kind of thing, I think, I helped to do that, which is really cool. But I just think that we've completely lost our way now, in terms of, continuing that momentum. And we've just gone down this horrible cul-de-sac of reporting and data and sort of, we've created a whole industry around sort of proving that we are really messing the planet up. And so at Nature Metrics, I used to call it documenting extinction. It's sort of like there's a whole industry, a massive industry around providing data and providing reporting and that sort of thing, which is absolutely necessary. We really need data and reporting, but the idea of data is to help you to know what to do next, and the idea of reporting is that you're reporting to someone that cares, or you're forced to make these numbers look better every year. And unfortunately, we've completely lost sight of that, and we're now, sort of tied ourselves in knots with reporting. And I think that, I don't think that's by mistake. I think it's a very deliberate distraction that the corporate world has created, so that we're talking about how much reporting to do and not talking about our whole entire economic system and all the businesses within it are just governed in the wrong way to create a planet that is suitable for humans to live on in the future. So it's, I think that feels like a shame, feels like a sort of a slightly underestimated way to say it, but you know what I mean.
A small disaster, in fact, that is unfolding every day before our eyes.
Yeah.
It is a frustration that I share, Katie, and all of these reports and compliance. And you talk to, one of the things I note is that when I first started TFT back in 1999, there really were no sustainability managers in any of these companies. And always talk to the procurement people.
Yes.
And, they were the ones that were buying all of the stuff. And, we were there trying to pioneer responsible sourcing. And it was, no, that's our supplier. Nothing to do with me. I didn't destroy that forest. I didn't put in that child labour. That's our supplier. We're good guys.
Yeah.
And so the ownership of it wasn't there. But, one of the things I say today as a positive is a sort of positive, is that most companies now do have not just a sustainability manager, and usually a qualified one, as opposed to the old guy that's 2 days from retiring, and they've just given him that to get him to the end of his career, which is so much of what I saw in the early years.
Yeah.
There's actually trained people, and often there's actually a team, but so often that team is dedicated to just reporting, gathering data for compliance reports, or let's not get me started on certification. I've just come back from Uganda visiting a coffee cooperative. They've got 60 extension officers whose job is to go out and work with the 20,000 farmers that they support to help them improve their yields. Guess what? They don't do any of that because they've got to gather the information so that they can get one of their 6 or 7 certificates that they've got to get to be able to prove themselves able to trade. And meanwhile, the farmers are struggling with their yield. And so this is one of these things where you say, well, it's good that we've got all these people, but what are they spending their time doing? Meanwhile, we're all cooking with climate change, and the opportunity for despair comes in. Let's come back to that. I'd like to touch on later on. What keeps you going and things like that. Yeah. Let's not talk about that now, because you mentioned Nature Metrics. Just tell us about that journey to Nature Metrics, and then what you learned on that journey, and why you joined Nature Metrics, and who are they?
Yes, yeah, okay. So from M&S, I spent some time at PricewaterhouseCoopers, consulting for other sort of retail consumer folk on sustainability strategy. Didn't find that was my sort of true home. Loved the team and everything like that, but consulting in a big corporate wasn't really for me. Then I went to WWF Indonesia. So I decided, I want to spend some time at the other end of supply chains, really thinking about, how do we change things on the ground? And that was super fascinating. I think big picture, I was part of a team that was sort of drafted in by the international WWF International to work with Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei to try and make all the projects and programs that was happening in Borneo sort of fit together a bit better. And so, create a narrative and a framework. And I was leading on the private sector stuff. And where we got to, which again, I think was sort of very leading at the time, but it's very well accepted now, was we put this idea of a green economy on the table, which hadn't been part of the parlance in like the Asian Development Bank or the Indonesian government or anything like that. And we sort of said, the game is, how do we make trees worth more standing than they are cut down? And that was our mantra. And as I say, like that again is like relatively obvious now, but 15 years ago was quite revolutionary. So we did a lot of work around how do we engage with business rather than fight business? How do we think about what a sustainable economy looks like? And also, interestingly, there I was arguing for more measures, because actually you couldn't believe the donor reports that WWF Indonesia had to write. I mean, I'm sure you saw them at TFT too, but there were some people that had 450 lines on an Excel spreadsheet that were their objectives from various donor projects. And I would say 99% of them were about have a meeting, have a workshop. There were no outcomes-based objectives. And I said, well, look, let's just look at the forest. If there's 22 million hectares, what chunk of it do we want to be protected? And what do we need to do that? What chunk of it do we want to be sustainable palm oil? And what do we need to do that? And sort of bring a more sort of like business approach to
outcomes focus.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say I had mixed success with that. But as I say, I think actually still today, the kind of green economy narrative and the recognition that you can't just tell people to stop doing stuff. And that's both in terms of like, stop cutting down the trees or stop eating the orangutans or whatever it is. It's also, you can't, you've got to find something else to do. And I think even in the early days of the carbon projects, RED Plus, it was sort of like, how can we pay people to go away and not do anything? And that was just, to me, just seemed like a bonkers thing to do, because, like what human just says, I'll just have a little bit of money and sit around and do nothing. And, you have all these, terrible sort of other things that happen when the economics are wrong and the purpose that you give to people is wrong. And so I learned an awful lot, and I hope had left a sort of slightly positive footprint behind. But there were lots and lots of challenges in working in an NGO setting, I think, particularly in a place like Indonesia. So that was super fascinating, but led me to come back to the UK when I decided to have kids and study environmental economics, because then I really wanted to understand this point about how do we value nature and how do we understand what it does for us, and how do we bring nature into the conversation when you're looking at cost benefit analysis or, sort of trying to make the case for nature. And I felt very positive about that idea when I left Indonesia, because it made so much sense. But then I got to my master's and realized that actually the language between ecologists and economists isn't really there. The understanding of what nature does for us is so thin that we actually risk almost making the case to destroy it by only valuing the tiny little bits that we know that nature does. And also the sort of marginal cost accounting, like, what do we lose if we take down this tree and this tree and this tree, sort of is very inadequate. And
how do we compensate it by protecting
the systems thinking that we've got, for nature.
Yeah, planting a eucalyptus plantation over there, somewhere. It's trees.
Exactly, because we are part of this incredible web of life. And being the idea that you can take away one part and value what you've just lost without understanding what that does for the whole, for me felt very inadequate. And so as a sort of ecologist in the room, where most of the people studying that were economists, it was really fascinating and led me to believe, look, anywhere that we can use economics and valuation techniques to argue for nature, and we can get, use that as a tool, brilliant. But it's by far and away not the silver bullet that I was looking for in terms of, making the case. And I guess more and more as I've got older, I've actually become more of the thought that data and economics and all that sort of thing, there's only so far that can take us. But if we have lost our connection completely with nature and our understanding of how important nature is, and actually getting that back and helping people to understand and feel part of nature and understand that they're part of nature and they can't live without it, is probably better than saying, oh, it's worth 2 trillion or it's worth 3 trillion, because ultimately it's infinitely valuable. If it's gone, we can't eat money. We can't survive. And I think I've been to too many meetings and conferences recently about nature finance and that sort of thing, where people still believe that the opportunity is around creating more wealth, financial wealth with nature, rather than using financial wealth as a tool to make sure that we restore our living world so that we can survive.
Yeah. It's really trying to crunch nature into our economic system as opposed to moulding our economic system to support nature.
Yeah. So that was super fascinating. And then I ended up after my master's and after having my 2 lovely boys, deciding that I couldn't go back to big corporate life. As say, doing bad stuff a little bit less bad was not where it was at for me. So I decided I wanted to go into startups and do, bottom up, like businesses that change the world from day one. So I did an energy storage startup, Power Vault, and learned lots and lots of hard lessons there. And then
what would give a few little examples? What were some of the hard lessons you learnt there, Katie?
Well, I think sort of having a product that works.
That's important, right?
It's a good starting place. So we had a lot of false starts there, just trying to figure out what the right product was. And I think basically just tried to do way too much in one go. We sort of had the idea, we can build a battery and a battery management system and a smart grid connector and a box to put it in, and all, there were too many moving parts. And so that's one of the things in startups which entrepreneurs absolutely hate. You've got to pick your battles and be very, very focused on what you're going to do. And again, it's that thing of, I can't do everything this year, but if I am careful about what I do this year, I'm going to be super successful over the next 5 years, rather than like, I've got to do everything this year and then you sort of crash and burn.
Yeah.
No, actually, that company's still getting strong. And, despite learning a lot of hard lessons along the way, I think they've sort of come out the other side. But the chairman of Nature Metrics was also the chair of Power Vault. So I heard about this company that monitored nature with DNA and thought, oh, wow, in my time at Marks and Spencer, where I'd done lots of things on carbon and wood sourcing and palm oil and all sorts of different things, but really biodiversity and nature in and of itself was a really difficult thing to set targets on, because you couldn't really measure it. It was hard to manage it in that sense. And so I thought, oh, wow, this is really cool. And it kind of gets me back to my biology roots. And so it literally is going to take a sample of water or soil, extracting the DNA that's present from all the different species that have moved through that water or that soil, or even now air, and being able to then understand what species are living there, from big mammals and fish to bacteria and fungi and all the little stuff that's actually really important in providing us with a livable planet. So that was really cool. So I spent 5 years as CEO there. Took the business from 5 people to about 150, raised about £22 million in equity, took a lot of different VCs on board, impact VCs largely, and made an acquisition in North America. And we were providing data to NGOs, to nature-based solutions, to big mining companies, sort of the whole lot across, really about over 100 countries. So it was a really, really exciting business to run. But yeah, then decided to leave after 5 years.
Katie, there's more story, I'm sure, that you can share with us there. I mean, what had you deciding to leave there? You mentioned at one stage, you just mentioned that talking about impact investors. My experience with impact investors is often it's an exciting moment. They get all excited about what impact you can create until the deal's signed, and then they say, well, where's our 20% or sometimes more rate of return? And then they want to change the business and modify the business. Was that some of your experience going through that process? Congratulations on your success in securing the funds and growing the business. But I guess the other question, so let's maybe talk about that one. But the other question I guess I'd have is, do you feel all of this data and all of this information has helped make an impact?
Yeah.
Are you seeing changed practices as a result of organisations getting your reports, getting Nature Metrics reports? I know you're not there now, but what did you see through that journey?
Yeah, so I think I'll answer the last question first. So on the data side of things, I feel very torn. Nature data has got a long way to go to catch up with the volume of climate data we're producing. And if the measure of success of whether we'd solved climate change is on the amount of climate data we had, we'd be fine. But unfortunately, it's not. So there is definitely a curve we're going up, which says more nature data is better, but actually nature data which gives context and understanding of nature, because people's understanding of all life on Earth is so poor, and business leaders and governments take such poor decisions because they just don't understand nature. But I always said, I wish we'd found the technology of nature metrics 30 years ago, because we need to be having so much more sophisticated conversations now that everyone's running to catch up. But I got to the point where I felt, for me, data is really, really important, but for me, it's not floating my boat in terms of creating the impact I want it to create. And actually, the people that were using the data best were really the NGOs, and they were the ones that couldn't pay very much, and so we couldn't focus on them as much. And so there was a bit of a disconnect in terms of where you could have the most impact, and who was really buying the product. So I look back and I feel really proud that there's a lot of, in particular areas like fresh water, which is so understudied. And, the alternative is like dipping a electric rod into the water and electrocuting some fish. And that's how you sort of count them. Like DNA was doing really wonderful things in that sense. But I did get to the point where I feel like generally we're documenting extinction. This data isn't moving the needle fast enough to really, make the impact that I wanted to have in my career. And I think it's interesting on the impact investor side. I mean, there's two parts of this. One part is governments have been completely naive or incompetent in thinking that the private sector is going to solve everything for us. And so they go, but there's all this impact investment money, there's all this private sector money going in. And the impact investors get very excited that they're going to solve the world. But the overlap between what needs to be funded and what can provide a VC investment return is actually quite minimal. Like there's so much stuff that needs to be done that is regulatory driven or government driven, which will really crowd in private investment. But a lot of the private investment is actually failing because governments have failed to understand that all these businesses are making business cases based on, well, we're talking about climate change so much, so there's going to be some better regulation soon. Or we're talking about nature so much, there's going to be some better regulation soon. And that regulation never comes. And so the investments fail. And that's one of the things I found at Powervault. We were betting on Ofgem doing what it said it was going to do, which was to change the way electricity was priced so that you could, flex the grid and use renewables in a different way. And that just never happened. And so that's one side of it, which is just, there's only so much that impact investors can do. And I think we were overexcited about the ability for impact investment and in particular the VC model to change the world. And then for sure, the other part of it is I always understood before I got into the game that there were investors that really wanted to make a trade-off between return and impact. And actually all the impact investor conferences and things that I've been to recently are, how can we find alpha? How can we get more money by doing good? And that's okay. If that's how you want to, there are lots of things in a green revolution that we're in at the moment. There are lots of ways that you can make more money by doing green stuff. But there's also, and it comes back to my first point, like an awful lot of stuff that needs to be done that perhaps if you're going to do it in a fully regenerative way, isn't going to make you the maximum return. And I think that's the bit where I've always felt like there's this big missing middle of investors that walk the talk in terms of the trade-offs between, really truly regenerative business and returns, which I think is a big shame. And I think it's one of the things that I'd really like to see in, us think more broadly about in the economy. How do we not try to make everything that's good sort of pay for itself, as you say, with a sort of, 5 times return in 5 years or whatever, because I don't think a forest should have to do that. Why should it? The forest is actually keeping us alive. Isn't it enough that we just find a way to make it sustainable to manage, financially sustainable to manage those forests? Like, why do they have to also give us a return? And I know that that's the system we're in, but I always think, well, I've got one foot in the camp of like, I'm realistic. I live in a capitalist system, which is sort of really forgotten what capitalism, I don't think capitalism when it was first envisaged actually was what we are in now. But I live in that system, and I'm practical, and I like to get on and just do things that make an impact. But also, I also have this idea that we have to change the system if we're going to really, truly survive, really, in the sort of way, with the sort of lovely life that we actually have at the moment. I know that everyone enjoys that, but actually the human experience of the world today on average is really great. And we don't value that as much as we should.
Do you think we can change it, Katie? I mean, or do we have to there's a lot of talk about societal collapse that, and Jim Bendel a couple of years ago, I think it was 2018, so more than a couple of years ago now, a professor over in Wales published a paper internally in the university because he couldn't get it in any journal. They wouldn't publish it because it was too scary. And he was basically saying that societal collapse was inevitable based on the trends in the climate data and the future that we faced. It was 3 levels. And I can't remember what the second one was. That the third one was human extinction, and around about that time there was this term "INTHA," which emerged. It wasn't what Jim Bendel said, and I got despairing once and sort of misquoted him in a video I did, and someone said, Jim Bendel didn't say we're headed for extinction. I said, that's true, he didn't. But this term, inevitable near-term human extinction, and there's people saying humans would be extinct by 2026. So touch wood, that's not going to be the case.
Yes.
But what's your sense? I mean, sometimes I look at it and say, we've got to create as much positive impact as we can, do what we each can do. The idea that we are able to change the system, particularly through democratic means, where people vote for the candidate that's going to give them more of the things that they want. Do you think we can change the system, Katie, or do you think we really do have to have the system collapse around us and then rebuild it? If we still survive that process, that is.
Yeah, so I have thought a lot about this. So I saw a quote the other day which really resonated, which was someone said, it's harder to envisage the end of capitalism than it is the end of civilization. And I think on the face of it, a lot of people feel like that's true. But actually, I am more of an optimist. And I sort of think, for me, it's crazy, the idea that with all the human ingenuity and actually we do have a lot of altruism, but it's just been buried away by all the media and the negativity and the selfishness that capitalism has created. For me, it's more crazy to think that humans are just going to let ourselves go extinct with all the intelligence that we do have, than that we can't end capitalism as we know it. I'm not a kind of like, capitalism is awful. I just think the way that we've set it up at the moment, there's the governance that we have around it, the measures that we give it, the regulator, there's a lot that needs to change, but I don't think it means that we've all got to, go back to living in caves. So there's a model that is called Earth for All that the Club of Rome did. And I often think about this now. So I don't know if you have watched any of the Marvel movies, but in the Marvel movies...
Yes, I think I have. One or two, yeah. I think I used to watch Nemo and things like that.
Yeah, there's a moment in Endgame where basically all the Avengers are together and somebody can see into the future and he can see all the possible universes or all the sort of possible outcomes that might exist. And Iron Man says, is there an outcome where we survive? And he says, yes. And we know that he's just seen that there's 1 out of a billion outcomes where we survive.
We've got to find it.
And so, but the Avengers know, like there is one. And so we're going to keep fighting until that one, to try and make that one happen. And if it doesn't happen, well, we've fought and we've been there. And so I used to feel quite depressed and down and anxious about climate change. And now I'm just like, no, like whilst there's still a hope, just go for it. And you've got nothing to lose, have you? So this Earth for All model kind of puts that thinking from the Marvel movie into reality. So years ago, I think in the 70s, there was this modelling done. I can't remember, some Donna Meadows, I think it was, that sort of said, there's humanity is on course for a crash. And everyone is when the sort of first wave of sustainability came in the 70s, when people were saying, we're we're not doing well.
We're in deep poo.
Yeah. And then, Reagan and Thatcher and people like that came along and sort of said, oh, there's no limit to human ingenuity. We're just going to break the link between economic growth and destruction of the planet. So, all these people poo-poo, like, look, we're fine. We're still here and it's the 80s. Now, actually, the model hadn't said we're going to go extinct in the 80s or the 90s. It sort of said about the middle of this century. And so when they recently went back to it at the Club of Rome, they looked at how the data had tracked versus this model and realized the model was really quite accurate. And the data was tracking really quite well along the path of, we've got until the mid-century. And so then they added a load more new bits into the model and they looked for, like, is there a scenario where that doesn't happen? And there is. So that's really good. But
we just need one. We just need one.
Exactly, there's one. And you have to do a lot of really tough things really, really quickly. And it's interesting because part of what they've added in is this sort of social cohesion and trust stat into the model, which sort of says, if you have a trusting society and if you have more social cohesion and equality, you can get more difficult policies through. And I think this is what we're seeing at the moment. Like one of the most difficult things about society right now isn't how many trees we're chopping down or whatever. It's the fact that we can't even have a conversation any longer based on facts about where we are. This is really, really the most worrying thing. And that sort of scalar in the model about whether you have a trusting, cohesive society or not was like one of the biggest factors that could swing us one way or the other, and which is worrying. But so there were, I think they listed like 5 or 10 things that we needed to do. We are absolutely not doing them at the moment, but that's what drives me and gives me the passion that there's still we still have the chance to do this. And so we should just, spend as much time as we can without burning ourselves out and without, sort of feeling very miserable every day to try and make that reality happen.
I love that, Katie. That's how I live my life as well. And I was very fortunate to do a master's in Oxford way back in 1990. And just as I got there, a book was published written by a US professor. He's very old, and he'd been involved in bringing the first environmental policies into the US in the 1960s, Professor Linton Keith Caldwell. And he wrote a book called Between Two Worlds, Science, the Environmental Movement and Policy Choice. Interesting, he didn't talk about businesses at all. But a young fellow went into Blackwell's bookshop and somehow discovered that book in a building full of tens of thousands of books. There it was. And he talked exactly about this point. And he said, look, can humans make the changes that, given how clever we are, how artistic we are, how amazing we are when we work together, can we do it? And at that stage, he left the question open. He didn't, and he ended with this beautiful quote from a Spanish poet from 1916. So you have to forgive me that it uses the term man, but it says the poem was a verse in a poem, and it says, "Man is perishable, but let us perish resisting. And if it is nothingness that awaits us, let us so act that it may be an unjust fate." And I remember getting to the end of that book and I'm like, right, that's what I'm holding on to.
Yeah, so that's giving me goosebumps.
Yeah, let us so act that it may be an unjust fate. And it absolutely echoes what you've just said, Katie. And I often say to people, look, people say, oh, you're going out, you're doing this, you're doing that. Well, what else am I going to do? We've got to hold on to that potential one scenario out of billions that we can make it because, hey, the planet is too beautiful to just walk away from that outcome and just let the destruction unfold. So, it's really great to hear what you said there. It has, given me more inspiration. I hope it gives some inspiration to our listeners. And but really, before we get to the end, there's a couple more important questions. I'd love to hear what you're doing now. I know what you're doing now, and it's fascinating. But but can you share with us with the listeners about Re-genus? It sounds like a great project.
Yeah. So as I say, when I left Nature Metrics, I was really looking for where can I find something that's Nature Metrics can measure, but I can actually do the thing that's changing something on the ground. I really wanted that. So I looked around a bit and found my co-founder then, Daniel, who had started out on a project to try and create a peat-free, synthetic-free growing medium, and then had sort of gone down the route of looking at how fungi really helped plants to grow and how we could get natural nutrition rather than synthetic nutrition. And then I'd start applying that to agriculture. And so that was the point where I came in and we said, right, if we can change how agriculture and forestry apply fertilizer, and we can lean into nature and give the ground back its fungi to do the job of the nutrient cycling, which enables us to then use circular raw materials, natural raw materials to provide NPK and micro and trace elements, so all the things that the plant needs, but naturally. The big revelation to me, having worked in sustainability for so long, I couldn't believe I didn't know these stats, but like every ton of nitrogen you're putting on synthetic fertilizer is like 5 to 6 tons of carbon emissions. 50% of it just goes straight down the river because it's soluble, because without all the microbiome in the soil, you're basically just putting on soluble nitrogen that has to go straight into the plant. And if it rains, off it goes down the river, which is messing up all of our rivers. And the UK rivers are in a terrible state, as I'm sure they are in many places. And then, by putting the fungi back into the soil, you're getting, part of the web of life going again, and putting carbon back into the soils and all sorts of things. And so I was like, wow, this has the potential for huge impact, because agriculture is one of those sectors which, because of the margins and it's often one that people don't work with as much in sustainability, but actually by far and away it's the biggest sector impacting on nature. And ironically, it's also the biggest sector that nature impacts. But there have not been enough big strides made in making agriculture more sustainable and regenerative. So, yeah, we've got a small aim to try and displace 1% of the world's nitrogen fertilizer. So it'd be, I think, about 30 million tons of carbon a year that we could save if we did that. And we've raised some money from an impact investor called Planetary in Denmark, and actually they are one of the impact investors which, on both sides of the deal, have sort of really been open to discussing those trade-offs and the sort of the systems change that's needed, and so that's been like super, super cool. But they've set a really high bar now, so we're just fundraising and we're like, oh gosh, we've got to find others that can come in and sort of keep that vision alive, because I've said I want this company to be a regenerative company, which sounds easy to say, but actually genuinely putting back more than you take out is really, really hard. But that's the game. That's what we've got to do. And that will involve trade-offs, and it will involve difficult conversations, and and sometimes you won't be able to move as quick. So you can't use this source or that source or whatever. So I'm really excited about it. But yeah, it's a journey which has been interesting, because you say you're leaning into nature, and we grow fungi compost in the woods in Wales to sort of put into our fertilizer pellets. And when you tell an investor, I don't exactly know what fungi are there, because nature knows, and nature knows best. And there's
You've got to trust.
Thousands of fungi that we don't even know to science yet. And they're probably doing really important stuff. But that's really terrifying for a lot of investors, because they're like, well, what about from an IP standpoint? And can't everyone just do this if you're doing it? Because if it's just nature, and you're like, nature's, it's got like 200 million years head start on us in terms of innovation. And I often feel that humans are very arrogant in terms of how we think we can control nature, and manage it. Whereas actually, like our view is lean into it and let nature do some of the work for us. And then we're a business that sort of works in the way that life works. And that feels like the right sort of approach.
Absolutely does to me too, Katie. I think it's so funny what you say about investors. They and the arrogance of people thinking that we can control nature, until a big storm comes along or a big fire comes along, and there's all of the firefighting equipment that you invested in, and that didn't help much. And so we better do what we can to prevent nature from getting itself into that position where it's creating those disasters that we live through. Coming to the end, I mentioned at the start, there's so much I could talk about more. I love you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention what you said about trust, and that is something that really disturbs me. And I think, as you know, Katie, I haven't been always an advocate for certification, quite the contrary. One of the things that upsets me most about certification is that it's just founded on a lack of trust. Like, we've got to absolutely come down and audit you to death to make sure that you're doing what you say you're doing. And I'm like, well, there's that much evidence to suggest that these people are doing it. Can't we just trust? Can't we just bring a little bit of trust into the equation? Well, apparently not. And we get ourselves into that situation where all of so many good people are not doing the work to develop farming practices that support nature. They're just trying to get themselves through the audit. What a shame. But anyway, I mentioned in the introduction about LinkedIn, and I know LinkedIn is just one way for you and others to share what they feel about these things. And you're very active on LinkedIn. You make comments about lots of posts, which I always find, I don't read them all, but I read most of them. And that's when I thought, why haven't I interviewed Katie for a podcast? It just struck me as being, hello, silly boy, get on with it and message. And so I'm really grateful that you came on, Katie. But before we just talk about that, it seems to me that you have very strong values, and a lot of the posts, a lot of the things that you put on LinkedIn are very much linked to values, and not necessarily, maybe calling out others who are behaving in a way that is not true to what we might all consider to be good values. And you're very focused on impact. You're not here to muck around. Like you want, let's make some impact. And I love what you said at the start about spicy neurodivergence. I think that's really powerful. So it's coming all together. And the last thing that came across as you were talking about this thing about connection, and this is something that it's so apparent in all the work that I did at TFT. People say, how did you do it? How did you get these companies to make these big policy changes? Well, it wasn't so much what I did. I just helped them find their own connection back to themselves and back to nature, where they suddenly realised that chopping down that forest for profits, maybe there was another way. We didn't have to do it this way. There was a different way, as it were. And so all of these things have come across as you've been speaking. So I wanted to sort of ask you, as we come to a close, this question of your values. I often say to people, what are your values? And they can't really tell me, because they've never really thought about it. And it's a bit of an exercise where they go away, and I work with people. I say, go away and think about it for a bit, because it's when you're in a situation and those values are broken, where someone is operating in contrast to your strong values, they've crossed a red line, you know it, but you don't always put the connection and say, well, that means one of my values is truth, or one of my values is compassion. What would you feel that your values are, Katie? Because I know, I would say that you defend them very powerfully in everything that you've done. Have you thought about that? Have you ever sort of written them down and said, this is who I am?
I haven't. So that's a really tricky question, but one of the answers I guess I'd give is, I think a lot of people behind closed doors sort of want to be more human in their workplace, in their interactions and that sort of thing, because I truly believe that most humans do have a shared set of values that are innate in us, like just be good. Do you know what I mean? And I think everyone innately knows what being good is. But one of the things that one of the reasons that I do sort of use my voice on LinkedIn is that I think more and more people turn up to work and important jobs, even the sustainability people, and they just feel like, I've got to say what's expected of me. I've got to I can't bring my humanity to my workplace. I've got to sort of play a role, which is, I've got to make the business case. And the number of times I've heard, I've got to make the business case for nature, I've got to make the business case for this. And I think it's become a taboo to be able to sit in a boardroom and say, guys, this is the right thing to do. Humanity won't survive if everyone does what you're suggesting. Like, that is actually, you sort of be laughed at the boardroom. And I think I've got to a stage in my career now, and maybe it is my neurospiciness, where I sort of feel confident enough in what I bring that I can just tell the truth, and not, all sorts of people don't have the ability to tell the truth in their work because they're worried about being fired, or they don't have the confidence or whatever. And so I sort of think part of using my voice is just to help other people gain the sort of strength and have the role model that says, it's okay to call people out. Like I never get angry with someone. I never swear, but we should be able to call stuff out, and we should be able to be human first. And if you can have that conversation about this is just the right thing to do, how are we going to make the business case for it? That's okay. But saying we can only do it if there's a business case, and I'm focusing on that first, just always feels like a very, very grating, and it just hasn't worked. We spent 30 years trying to make the business case and talking about PR and brand and all that sort of thing, and really that sort of comes back to the regulatory piece and the fact that governments are really failing to sort of create the business case by just setting the boundaries within which boards and businesses should work, which would just make capitalism function so much better. So I think just, be a good human is kind of like my sort of overarching value. And I know that seems like a bit of a cop-out, but no. I do always try and do the right thing. And it does really get my sort of fire going if I see people that aren't doing the right thing. But yeah.
That's good enough, Katie. I think it's a great thing. and it's very clear to me that you actually live that. And it does seem like a good place for us to end, but there's one thing that I wanted to ask you, and we could probably have a whole podcast about this. Maybe you can just touch on it briefly. You mentioned when you were just talking there about being in the boardroom, and I know that guys is a generic term, and I use it myself. I use it a bit uncomfortably sometimes when I'm in the presence of women, and I say, hey, guys, because I think it can cover both genders.
Yeah.
But our listeners have probably worked out the fact by now that you are indeed a woman.
Yeah,
they're pretty smart listeners on the Scott Poynton podcast, and so I wonder if you could just touch on, over this long journey you've had through the corporate world, and the NGO world, all of the things that you're trying to do. Has being a woman been a difficult thing? Has there been moments when you think it's helped? Where are you? Where are we on balance, do you think, in that space?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think in the early parts of my career, I'd never even thought about gender imbalance or anything like that. I think being in boardrooms and being in front of investors who are largely male, and, the stats for VCs aren't good. I think it's 2% of VC money ends up with women founded and run companies or something very small like that. I think there I felt more of an impact. And I think I would characterize it like this. There's a feminine energy that you don't have to be a woman to have the feminine energy, but I think there's a way of interacting which is more female, and I think more and more investors want to invest in women, and they want more women in the boardroom. But the shift in terms of how do we bring the feminine energy into the boardroom, and how do we change the way the interactions happen, because it's not just about having a woman there, it's what does that diversity bring? So if you haven't just got a board that's all white males, it's not just to have some boobs in the boardroom. It's because you want to have a diversity of thought. And I think that's the bit that we're still really missing, which is how do we change the way we interact so that new energy that you've brought into the boardroom can really flourish and really support what you're trying to do. And that's where I feel like, again, the sort of focus on reporting and data and targets and all that sort of thing from a gender perspective or a minorities perspective is totally the wrong approach, because it's not understanding the why. It's just sort of saying, we need to meet a quota or whatever, but really embracing diversity and really saying, let's think how we can get diverse perspective in the boardroom, and that is a good thing. It will still take a little bit longer, I think.
Not quite there yet. Not quite there yet.
We'll get there.
We'll get there. I hope so. Katie, what a pleasure it's been to talk to you. And we've covered a lot of stuff, and so much of it so interesting that we could talk about it for a very long time. And so many times you've mentioned, I wrote it down as we were talking, providing for a living planet. And my sense is that you've put your shoulder to that wheel from a very early age, and you continue to push against it to try and do whatever you can to provide a living planet, not just for your own family but for the rest of the world. And I think you're onto something, and I really believe that you're talking about impact, you're talking about connection, and just being a good person, and holding on to that glimmer of hope that we can do something. I think the world's a better place for having you in it, Katie. And
thank you.
Yeah, it's my privilege to be able to welcome you on the podcast and to share your thoughts with so many people. And well, we should catch up again, because we'd love to hear about how Re-genus is going, and maybe in a year's time we can come again and talk again, and you can tell us what new lessons you've learned on this incredible journey that you're on. So thanks so much, Katie, for joining us today, and I bet we're going to get a lot of interesting thoughts and feedback on our discussion. So thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me on. Cheers.
Cheers.